Welcome everybody. For those that don't know me, my name is Ralph Cook. I'm a director at IMPOWER. I lead our work in adult social care across the country and the interface with health. As many of you will know, at IMPOWER we are really passionate about working with the sector to deliver a sustainable model for adult social care by fundamentally focusing on improving outcomes for people. Today, delighted that we're going to be hearing from 3 councils and 2 change journeys where we've been working with clients both in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough and in Bradford to really affect just that, a sustainable model of social care going forward. Our approach, can I have the, sorry, I can't see the slides. Can I see the next slide? And again, and again. Thank you. Our approach, which some of you will be familiar with, is called edge work. And really that is quite different. It's not about bringing new ideas. Our belief is that you and your frontline staff are where the valuable ideas are created about how we go about delivering good adult social care. What we bring in the framing of edge work is delivery execution. It's about how do we fundamentally implement this in a sustainable way and in a successful way over a period of time. And edge work is different because it recognises that we are working within a complex system. Adult social care and health are complex systems. And that within them, there are inherent complex problems which are different to complicated problems. And as such, they require a different approach to change, a different approach to traditional methods of delivering transformational change. About 18 months ago, we wrote a book called The Edge Work Manifesto, which captured that thinking conceptually. And then last year, we wrote a publication which was released about this time last year called The 5 Paths Forwards for Social Care, which are captured on your screen now. I don't know whether you can read those. I'm struggling. But there are 5 fundamental things that we believe the sector needs to grip and leaders within the sector need to grip if we are going to move the sector forward towards a sustainable model. They are as such on the screen: reframing ambition, really focusing on frontline and understanding behaviours, managing interfaces between services and organisations, which is where the real complexity exists, and then managing truths. And I'm delighted that we've got both Cambridgeshire and Bradford that are going to bring this to life in a very real way. I know that Bradford are going to touch on delivering at the front line and the work they've done around understanding and changing behaviours. And Cambridgeshire are going to touch more on managing trajectories and more to their success in Cambridgeshire. So although we've been struggling with the COVID pandemic in recent months, and it's presenting a real challenge for the sector, a paradigm shift, both opportunities and challenges as we transition out, the fundamentals of good adult social care remain unchanged. We'll touch a bit more on that later on. So I'm delighted to introduce Charlotte and Jackie from Cambridgeshire, and Bev and Fazila from Bradford. And if we can just go forward one more, please. Thank you. There's the agenda. So it's quite tightly packed. We're going to try and rattle through and most importantly, get to the plenary discussion and questions at the end because we want to have some discussion and debate with you all. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to Charlotte.
Right. Morning, everybody. Can I have the first slide? Thank you. My name is Charlotte Black. I'm the ADASS for Cambridge County Council and Peterborough City Council. So I work across 2 local authorities. Been doing that for a couple of years now. I'm just going to take you through a bit of an overview of a strategic programme that we've called across Cambridge and Peterborough, which is called the Adults Positive Challenge Programme. And fundamentally, that was about what's on this slide, which was really transforming the way in which we were working to make sure that people are supported to remain as independent as possible in and by their communities. And I just thought I might be able to say a couple of things about why, as the ADASS, I personally really wanted to do this. I mean, the first reason was that I had started a role across 2 councils with very different approaches, and I wanted a sort of unifying strategy, a unifying approach that everyone could sign up to, members and frontline staff. We'd done quite a lot. I was originally just in Cambridgeshire, and we'd done a lot of work putting in place changing things like our front door, developing our approach to direct payments, completely changing our approach to things like assessments and reviews and the paperwork that went with that, and had a new system in place. But it just felt like we needed something that would both bring all of that together, but would also help our members understand and be confident about where we were going. And the other very major motivation for me was that I knew that I had a big savings stroke demand management target, and I wanted to achieve that through a strategic approach rather than just taking money out of services on a kind of incremental basis. And the thing in terms of this session today is just to say that I think our response to COVID probably would have been quite different without this. So it's been really valuable over the last very challenging few months. Next slide, please. So if people, I think the slides aren't that brilliant in terms of visibility, so I'm just going to talk through broadly what's on them without reading them out. So the programme aim really was, as I say, we'd already done quite a lot of work. We also had a pilot going on in one of the councils, which was trialling the Bertsorg approach to social care. So we had quite a lot of sign up really to the overarching approach, and the three main elements were a place-based approach, so making sure that as far as possible we were developing the support in a kind of within a community network context, a high level of commitment to early intervention and prevention, so making sure basically at every interaction we used every opportunity to and the phrase we ended up using a lot was to change the conversation. So whether it was our website, whether that was our letters about finance, for example, our financial assessment process, any interaction or any sort of interface that we had with the community, we wanted to use that as an opportunity to really promote quite a different approach and a different way of talking about adult social care, adult social care needs. And as I say, the third bullet point really says that there was also a very hard edge target around this, which was we had to deliver some significant changes in terms of our budget in both councils. So Peterborough City Council, we had to basically reduce our costs, so deliver savings and reduce demand. And in Cambridgeshire, we had a significant target of 3.8 million, which was basically the funding that we would otherwise have achieved to meet demographic demand. So basically what we had to do was we had to manage without that. So that was a pretty big motivator to do what we've also felt was the right thing. Next slide, please. So what the next slide shows, which people may not be able to see, is we started off with 8 work streams for 1920. And one of the things I think it's really helpful in these kind of sessions to talk about is what we learned. So I think what we learned was that we didn't need 8 work streams, and so we actually reduced this in the end. We started off with things like a work stream called panel, and we had a work stream which was focused on commissioning and neighbourhood-based operating model, but actually fairly quickly realised that those were the kind of how, and we needed to focus on the what. So the main work streams were increasing carer support, embedding technology, targeting our enablement service, preparing for adulthood, so working with particularly the 0 to 25 children with disabilities teams to think about how they prepared for adulthood and the transition, and build independence much more into that process, of aspiration around independence. And the last one, which was probably the unifying theme, which was changing the conversation. And so I think what we probably learned from that process was actually to keep this as simple as possible. And we basically only included work streams and proposals in those work streams where we could have a very tangible intervention which would deliver a change in activity, which we could equally measure in terms of the benefit that would come with that. And I can honestly say we didn't necessarily have all the skills to do that as well as we needed to do that as possible. So where IMPOWER were very valuable to us was particularly the work around how to articulate the benefits that we had achieved. So moving on to the next slide, please. That's a little bit clearer. So what did we achieve? In terms of the bottom line financial benefits, so in Cambridgeshire we avoided, I think, about £3 million worth of costs. So we didn't achieve our 3.8 target, which we didn't think was necessarily going to be possible. And in Peterborough, we achieved about 1.5 million overall in terms of cost avoidance and savings. So, and there were also some other things that we did that sort of got built into our overarching target. So things that we were particularly pleased with were, through this programme, we really improved our reviews performance, which wasn't great. So we had very targeted reviews and really concentrated on improving that. We, as I say, delivered around 5 million across both councils. I think we changed the quality and number of conversations that we were having, particularly with carers. So we had a really big focus with carers, and that's been really useful to build on through COVID. We increased our use of tech-enabled care from about 38% to 80% in terms of referrals that involved tech-enabled care. We increased our use of our public-facing information and websites, and we also increased the proportion of people leaving ratement with no ongoing care requirements. So the detail of the percentages is in the slides, but I think in a way what that demonstrates is what was really important to us was to have some quite tangible things that we could A, say did we or didn't we, and B, say how did that actually reduce, how did that promote independence most importantly and outcomes, but how did that reduce the cost of care. Next slide please. So one of the things that we developed working with IMPOWER was a methodological trajectory management, and in my experience the best ideas are often the simplest. So it's kind of not as complicated as it sounds actually. So each month we had what we called a trajectory board, and at that trajectory board we looked at our performance on this, and we had a number of measures that I've just gone through to say, well, how are we doing on those? But we also had sitting around the table corporate colleagues, finance, business intelligence colleagues who helped us turn what we saw as sort of key adult social care measures into a clear measure of financial benefit. And that got us away from traditional reporting practice to sort of much more qualitative measures. It wasn't always straightforward, so sometimes there was a real conflict between what we called the bottom-up targets that we wanted to achieve and the kind of top-down, the top-down being obviously the reduction in the costs of care. So it was far from straightforward, and Jackie will come on in a moment to talk about that from the perspective just of one of the work streams. Next slide, please. So we identified a number of key measures which are in the slide, which, so for example, we knew that what good would look like is that we would get an increase in uptake of universal services in our early help service, but we would see a reduction in contacts and referrals for statutory services, and we would see improvements in things like our reviews performance, but also that we would see a reduction in long-term package starts. And so we were sort of fairly clear about what good would look like, and that gave us something to monitor. And as I say, it wasn't a linear process sometimes, and actually through COVID we had to suspend some of these measures because it just wasn't going to make sense. But in the kind of pre-COVID period, we got quite good at kind of checking on these every month and seeing where they were, and then checking how that aligned with the kind of top-down bit, which was actually what are the costs of care. And inevitably sometimes, you know, we do a load of activity around tech, for example, but we would get a delay in terms of when we saw the financial benefit of that. But it just gave something for our members and our corporate colleagues who didn't really understand adult social care, hadn't had much involvement in it. It really widened the understanding and the awareness of what it is that we do and what good looks like. Moving on, the next slide just gives some examples of that. So shows how we, in both councils, although it's never a straight line, we got an increase in uptake of our information advice, so significant increase in our web activity, online activity, so people looking for and getting the information that they needed. And we did do quite a lot of work using the sort of behavioural science methodology that IMPOWER bring to really look at what was the language that we were using, what were the messages that we were using. We thought we were doing something that was strengths-based and asset-based, so we thought we'd done all that. But actually when we looked at it again, we did have to make quite a few changes, and that did drive up the activity quite a lot. And then finally from me, the next slide is just showing also changes to contacts. So our contacts for us, that's actually contacts through to our statutory services. We changed our pathways quite a lot and tried to sort of front load the early start of the pathway so that people could get as much possible help and support through not just obviously online advice, but also our early help service and our arraignment service, so that as far as possible we gave people the support they needed when they needed it and didn't put people through an unnecessary process of checking eligibility, unless we really felt that was what was going to be needed. And the feedback we had from the people that we're supporting was that was really welcome, a significant improvement. So I'm just going to hand over to Jackie, who's Assistant Director, working with me, and she was the sort of senior lead on one of the work. So each work stream had an SRO, Senior Responsible Officer, and that was also really crucial to success. So Jackie will talk very briefly just about the work we did on tech.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. Good morning, everybody. Charlotte said I was responsible for the embedding technology-enabled care. At the start of this process, I think we thought that we were quite good with using assistive technology. We've been using it for years. And in my conversation with frontline staff, if I asked them if they thought they were using it well, the answer was usually, yes, of course we are, Jackie, what are you talking about? So we then worked with IMPOWER to test that in a really constructive way and engaging way. And what we learned was that while we were good at using tech, we could do better. I think historically we'd been quite focused on volumes and inputs, and we sort of realised that we had to make a shift to start talking about outcomes and consequences and make sure that ownership of the deployment of technology was really locally owned and well understood. So in this slightly busy graph that I've got here, I'll try to just explain it quickly. The bars show the number of completed interventions in the month by type. The dark line was our trajectory or the avoided cost saving, the avoided cost targets we had every month. And the light blue line is the line that showed us actually how much we were achieving. So you'll see in this that from April to July, we weren't doing as well as we thought we should have been doing, and so we had to have a much more sort of focused effort on it. And so we did a number of things. We recalibrated our training. We turned it into bite-sized pieces, so staff could engage in it much more easily. And that was looking about the sort of explaining and make sure they understood what tech can do, and by taking some of the strength-based conversation techniques, ensuring that they're able to really sell tech to people who might have been a bit reluctant to have this stuff in their house. And we also embarked upon having leadership huddles in each team every week, and where decisions had been made about changing care packages, what they were responsible for doing was just reviewing that and making sure that all the work streams, including tech, were applied. We also, with the data we got, we actually developed a dashboard that actually gave individual teams information about the referrals they'd made and the outcomes of those referrals. And what that enabled us to do was basically just to show teams the variation in performance, and without being overcritical about it, ask them to go away and have a look at why teams where we should have expected there to be a sort of similar profile of activity were different, and to reinforce the messages in the teams about what outcomes we were looking for. And it just kept the momentum going in terms of looking at making sure that every time we weren't missing an opportunity to apply the technology. The other thing we did is with IMPOWER and using the data that we had over quite a long period of time, we did a sort of longitudinal analysis of the shelf life of each intervention, so that we're actually able to put a more accurate value to each of those interventions. And what you can see is by September, the combination of all of those things is actually slowly starting to have a really significant impact on the avoided costs that we were achieving. In terms of how we're working now in COVID times, one of the things that we've done very quickly to try to ensure that we maintain this momentum is that all our tech training is now virtual. As of next week, we're restarting again the tech huddles, and we're actually looking as well about how we can offer tech huddles and tech champions in other areas such as libraries. And I think what we've seen clearly, our activity in April was lower than we expected, but by last month we can really start to see it picking up, and we really now want to capitalise on that, because I think a lot of people now are using technology in the way they never thought it was possible a few months ago, and we really need to build on that to make sure that everybody who can benefit from technology in supporting their care has access to it. Thank you. Back to you, Charlotte.
Okay, next slide, thank you. So just finally from me, I think what having had a programme like this has done for us is it's really helped steer our COVID response. So it was really interesting that as we started to get into kind of some of the really challenging and complex kind of scenarios, which I know a lot of people have experienced in recent months, it felt like staff were quite quick to change and adapt, and also, and I'm sure that's the case across the country actually, but particularly things like our work around, as Jackie's saying, our work around tech, particularly our work around carers, which Richard Webb mentioned in the last session. It meant that we were kind of really ready to go to kind of up our game on carers and think, well, what else can we do? We'd already built and established those links and our relationships with all the carers who were known to us. And we were able to tap into the work that was going on in terms of the shielded group and think, well, what are the work that we've done with carers would apply to that group? So I think it just really has really helped us to respond to a really challenging situation in a really positive way. And also the other thing is it really helped our members, because some of the language, it was almost like we had a shared language and a shared set of principles and an approach that we could continue to apply. We're obviously now thinking again about the programme and what do we know about demand going forward, and how do we need to reframe the programme based on what we know so far, and as many people have acknowledged already this morning, what we don't entirely know what's ahead. But I think if I didn't have a programme like this in place, then I would basically be establishing one. And for me, it's absolutely critical to getting a cohesive approach across two councils, which both staff and members are completely signed up to. So I really hope it's been useful, and very happy to take any questions or for people to follow up with us afterwards. Thank you. It's over to Bev, I think.
Thank you.
Okay. That one off. So, good morning, everybody. I'd like to be able to see you in person, but obviously in the current circumstances, we can't do that. I hope that we can share our experiences from Bradford with you. There seems to be a bit of feedback on this line. I'm not sure what's causing that. Hopefully it will become a bit clearer. Myself and my colleague Bazila just going to take you through the next set of slides. So could I have the next slide, please? Okay. Sorry, Kath. Having a bit of a technical problem here. I'll try again. So we're starting from a position of wanting to support people in Bradford to be happy, healthy and at home, and to be as independent as possible. And I think resonate with Charlotte and Jackie's experience that our first question was, why were we not doing that in the most effective way that we could? And we really needed to think about, we've got some really good ideas, we've got some fabulous staff, but actually it wasn't all coming together. And so we started to work with our colleagues at IMPOWER to understand what was happening in the system. For me, it's trying to understand the data. What is it telling us? We didn't know that. But also trying to understand the culture and the practice. Changing processes on their own doesn't change hearts and minds. It doesn't get buy-in from nearly 2,000 staff who have to live this, understand it and own it. And so the projects that we developed and the work that we did was really to focus on the Bradford vision. It's not the IMPOWER vision, it's not anything else other than how IMPOWER help us deliver that vision and change our culture and practice. Could I have the next slide, please? So we've talked about how we introduce the programme to maximise people's independence, but we really wanted to focus on a number of things that were not helping us. We had an over-reliance on residential care and oversupply, and we had very good detox figures, but we wondered if we, in helping people move quickly, that we weren't always giving them the time to support. And like colleagues, we were also facing a £7 million overspend, which we'd had doggedly for 3 years that we had been unable to shift. And so we were trying to find ways of shifting the money so that we could get best value out of it. And we knew that supporting people differently would cost a little bit more in the beginning, but the long-term benefits are well known and well rehearsed, and I don't need to go through that. But when you're in a financially difficult time, it's very hard to free up the money. And that's why we had to fundamentally think about how we use our commissioning activity. For me, commissioning is the key to unlocking the cash. And if we can shift and move the power and the dynamics, then that would be what we would want to do. I think what we were saying was that we wanted to establish the programs that would really help us deliver that independent vision and way forward. So if I could just go to the next slide, please. So we understood our vision, but actually we hadn't shared it enough with people. We hadn't focused on what does that actually mean? How are we doing things now? And how could it be different in order to get the maximum benefit? We wanted to empower our frontline teams. Like Jackie, we'd inherited some savings targets that were around cutting the numbers of staff. And we wanted to reverse that, but we still had a target to meet. And we wanted to invest in our staff and ensure that they had the tools at their fingertips. One of the, I think, biggest challenges for us was introducing the small budgets, as they're now known. And Fazil is going to talk about those shortly. But it was very scary at the beginning to say to quite a lot of social workers, here you are, there's £200 to try and support somebody differently so they don't need care. Certainly trying to support my finance colleagues and elected members through this challenge was interesting, and I must admit to a few sleepless nights. But I understood culture change when on one of our first road shows, staff were saying, please tell me how to get my hands on the £200. That's all I need to be able to do. On a subsequent roadshow, some 6 months later, when I was talking about small budgets, I got told off for using £200 because didn't I know better? Some things cost a lot less than that and some things are for free. So I was clearly giving the wrong message. But I think for me, that's where the culture and the practice meets the process. But it is about that sort of real strengthened relationships and a very clear, simplistic message, really. The 3 conversations or the 3-tier approach is what can we do to avoid, reduce or delay the need for care when it isn't exactly necessary, and we can focus on doing alternative things. And what I did like in the trajectories work was really trying to frame that in with the staff team. Staff sat down with IMPOWER colleagues and worked out in the recent reviews and assessments where we could have done something different. What would have been the impact if we'd had something else available to us at that time? And they came up with the trajectories. We're talking about, we could have made a 40% difference from people going into care. So it was really important that staff owned it and worked with it on the front, from the front line, but right the way through every level and every section of our department. So could I have the next slide, please? One of the examples was our Access Hub. Access was our front door. It was where people first contact us. And going through this process, this team were really bought into this different way of working. They had daily huddles and they looked at the strengths-based work, the behavioural science, and actually really challenged us on what they were called. they said, we don't want to be access to services. We are more than that. We are something else. And so we had a competition to change the name, and Independence Advice Hub won. And one of our colleagues won a prize that I had to present at one of our future road shows. But it really showed that insight. And I think the team were really brave, because what they did, they allowed each other to be filmed and video and recorded in some of their interactions and have their colleagues challenge that. That's a very brave thing to do. But I think they learnt and grew. And it was never quite enough. So, they managed to shift 87% of contacts going to different routes through the council or back into community. But they were concerned there's a balance between maximising independence and not neglecting somebody. So then they developed a 3-week assurance process, 3-week ring back. We found that just over 90% of people had either acted upon what was advised and were happy with where they were at this moment in time. What it also meant was we could get the other 10% really quickly before that position changed and start to do some further detailed work with them. So it was an ongoing and evolving process that really helped us to get to those results without it just being a process-driven target. And that's really, really important. Let's go on to the next slide, please. There's a lot of things that people said about what they wanted to do and what they got out of it. And there's just a few quotes here. But we did shift time. We did make time available. We had people come and change the way in which they assess. Sorry, are we having problems? Okay. I'll carry on because I can't hear anything else at the moment. But I think that for me, there was a point when a roadshow member of staff came and said, Bev, I've heard all of this before, and I've been here in Bradford for 20 years, but I really like what I'm doing now. I get so much satisfaction in just being able to do those small things that really make a difference. And I'm going to hand over at this point to Fazila so that she can share her experience as a service manager at this time.
Morning. If I could have the next slide, please. So I'm Fazila Hafji, I'm the Service Manager for Learning Disabilities and Autism in Bradford Council. And I wanted to bring to life a bit more what Bev had talked about in the small budgets. So small budgets refers to £200 maximum that we encourage social workers to engage with the people that we provide care and support to look at creatively how we use that money to maintain independence and become less reliant on services. And some of these, I've got 3 examples that I'd like to talk through, and they're really simple examples, but really kind of highlight how we can maintain people's independence and avoid dependency on services. So the first one is quite a simple example of a service user that required some support with washing at home and drying of her clothes. And the kind of response from the social worker originally was, why don't we put in some domiciliary care and support a couple of times a week where somebody comes in and does the washing, and that will resolve some of the issues. Having had a deeper conversation with the individual, what transpired is the actual washing machine that was the issue. So the washing machine was quite cumbersome, it was old, and the service user found it really difficult to access putting the clothes in. And what we did in the end was we bought a new washing machine which cost less than £200, £190. And what that allowed the individual to do was maintain her independence by doing the washing on her own. And actually, longer term, what we found was that we were making a saving. Because if you know the cost of domiciliary care, we would easily accrue £190 worth of domiciliary care in the first couple of weeks. It also, having had a conversation with her, we know that this would then avoid longer term dependency with increasing services as time went on. So that's a really simple example of investing in equipment that can avoid that level of dependency. The second one is probably one of my favourites, and I talk about it because I was quite heavily involved in this particular case. We're talking about a young woman who was a single parent. She had a degenerative disc disorder. At the time that we got involved in her life, she'd just split up with her partner, which was already having an impact on her mental health and her emotional well-being. She took pride in the way she presented, and what was really important to her in her life was supporting her daughter. Her daughter was of school age, but as her disorder began to deteriorate, she was unable to maintain how she looked, which was really important to her. So she was becoming less and less motivated to engage in activities. She avoided the school run, and that had an impact on her relationship with her daughter. So we talked about how we could support her with this area, and quite a simple investment in a long arm hairdryer with a stand and a long arm equipment that helped with the conditioning equipment then enabled her to invest back in herself, and thus motivating her and engaging back and building her relationship with her daughter. For mums, I'm a mum, and I think that's really important. And she felt that this impacted on how she was perceived at school. She felt that people judged on her ability to parent and her competency in those areas. And just investing in something as small as £27.78 enabled this woman to really gain her confidence again and start building those relationships and engage with the community again. The final example is of a lady who was in her early 40s. She was a home economics teacher and then had a stroke. So for a period of 3 years, kind of struggled with verbal communication. And the stroke had impacted on her right arm, and that meant it contracted a lot. She, having been a home economics teacher, one of her hobbies, apart from it being her job, was that she enjoyed baking. Having had this stroke meant that she was less able to engage in these activities. She talked about how her life, she felt, had come crumbling around her. She couldn't engage in her job and she couldn't engage in her hobbies. This had an impact on her emotional health and her physical health. Having discussed this with the social worker, they kind of explored what kind of things were important to her, and these were really important to her. We were able to identify some small equipment, again, didn't cost any money at all in the big scheme of things. We were able to get a mixing bowl with some suction at the bottom, which stopped the bowl from moving when she would use it, so she would be able to use one hand. We were able to use an adapted pan stand and some further adapted baking equipment. This again allowed her to engage back in things that were really important to her in her life. What became really obvious for me as a service manager when we're talking about trajectories and saving efficiencies, that actually if we do the right thing with people, engage with people and support them in preventative measures, that in itself becomes a natural efficiency saving. So I get social really focused with the individual about what they want and how people want to live their lives. If I could have the next slide, please. When I first began managing the learning disabilities team, we looked at what was currently in terms of the configuration of the team, and what I was really conscious about is that how much we hadn't engaged with people with learning disabilities and how we'd made lots of assumptions of how learning disabled people wanted to be supported. So the first thing we did was engage with people through something that we call big conversations. We call it the big conversation, but it was actually the big listen, and that was engaging with the Bradford district and engaging with people who use services, our partners in the private sector, and lots of engagement with the voluntary sector, and to really hear about how people wanted to be supported. Through doing this, we reconfigured our learning disabilities services, and we now have a bigger front door service than we've ever had, and we recognise that actually prevention is the key for the reliance on services going forward. And we recognised that we couldn't do this on our own. Health and social care really had to integrate, but what also was really obvious that we needed housing colleagues to engage with us. We now have 2 occupational therapists that are in our front door duty service and really help with identifying tech equipment, which our colleagues have talked about earlier, and how we can keep people in their home independent without having reliance on people actually coming into their homes. A big thing that came through engaging with people with learning disabilities is that often they only have paid support in their life. And I can imagine what that must be like to have your own natural connections, your family, your friends. So we started working with our communities and partners to look at how we can build stronger connections and really build on that CLS approach. And we recognised that actually this was a really new way of working for some of our social workers. And we introduced something with our IMPOWER colleagues called huddles, which is really protected time for our social workers to engage with one another and to really challenge one another. So once they come up with a challenge for themselves, and how do they overcome that? Or actually they come with a view, and social workers can really support one another in creative ways and methods to overcome any issues that they might perceive. So we ensured that social workers really had that protected time when embedding this new approach to working with individuals. If I could have the next slide, please. So having made these huge changes to our learning disability services, COVID arrived, and we didn't really know what COVID was going to bring for us. And I don't think many of us know what COVID is going to leave for us, if at any point that it will go. What I was really conscious about is that in COVID, we still needed to do what we had been doing, which is keep business as usual going, but also make sure that we continue to support and listen to people with learning disabilities about how they want to be supported. Even in these really challenging times, we knew that we had to keep activities going. We knew that we had to ensure that people were supported, and we knew that there was a shielded group that we needed to pay particular attention to. But how could we do that where we were challenged with face-to-face meetings, new ways of working in terms of online platforms? How do we engage with people who wouldn't normally have thought of these ways of engaging with individuals? So we created a survey and we kept in touch with people with learning disabilities through this survey, and we talked to them about what did they have pre-COVID, what did they have during COVID, and how do they want to be supported going post-COVID. We recognise that we've got lots of modelling, remodelling, and lots of opportunities to do things differently as a result of the experience that people have had. But we also recognise there's some imminent stuff in terms of supporting people through, as restrictions have eased, people have now gone back to work. So where individuals could have been supported by their own family members, they're now having to return to work. So there's some short-term work that we need to do, and there's some longer-term work that we can do. We're looking at some of the learning disabled surveys that we've done and triangulate that with our operations team, which obviously I support and manage, with our commissioning team, which Bev has already talked about, are really integral to doing things differently going forward, and recognising that lots of services are provided by independent providers. So we can't do this on our own. We need to triangulate our work and make sure that in the middle of that triangle, we've got the person who uses services and their family, in ensuring that we're listening to them and offering the support that we want to offer. And we need to recognise that whilst we're working with these individuals, what might have been important pre-COVID is probably going to be different post-COVID. So if you'd have asked somebody pre-COVID what's important to you, I'm sure that safety probably wasn't as high on the agenda as it is now. So somebody who might want to return to day opportunities might be slightly anxious of sharing space with a number of people. So we're really working with individuals to feel like when they do go back to accessing some sort of day opportunities, that it's safe, but it's also what they want going forward. If I could have the next slide, please. So these are some of the responses that we've already collated from the survey, and what's really obvious and is a really big theme coming through from people who have learning disabilities is employment. So we take for granted as people who don't need care and support things like love, things like hope, things like having access to our own front door, our own homes, and taking for granted that we go to work. And lots of people have said to us that actually through COVID and pre-COVID, that actually they want meaningful employment. They don't just want to go in a day service. And actually for some people, day service might be appropriate, but for lots of people, they want to be supported with a view to seeking employment. So whatever we do going forward, I think employment is going to be a really strong theme going forward. I'm going to pass back to Bev, who's got some closing thoughts.
Thank you, Fazila. Just very quickly, I just wanted to say that reinforce the message. What we did was the right thing for people, and working with people and hearing them. What that delivered for the first time in 4 years was not only did we meet our savings target, we actually came in underspent at £2.5 million. But it was the way in which we worked together, empowering the front line, working with our colleagues at IMPOWER to have a very systematic view that helped us get the best out of the ideas that we would have had anyway. So I just wanted to end on that point, and I think we're going back to Ralph now.
Thank you. Really appreciate that, Charlotte, Jackie, Bev and Fazila. Just to wrap up, so can we have the next slide? Thank you. And again, I'm really conscious of time, so I'm just going to rattle through these next two. I guess reflections on that are that we've consistently seen with the clients that are using an edge work approach that it's really helped them respond to and transition through the COVID pandemic, because it's given them greater resilience. And that's fundamentally because we move out of what we control into the spaces where we can influence across service and organisational boundaries, because we recognise that the journey of change is non-linear and will be influenced by the environment as we go. So we're more responsive to shocks that we trip over as we transition through change, and that we take a test and learn approach. So failure is okay. You know, it's as important to learn through failure as it is to get the interventions right. Have the next slide, please. Recently, I engaged with a broad range of ADASSs, up to 10 ADASSs, had conversations around their experience of COVID, and building on our experience of working with clients too, we've just released a paper which again you can access through the platform or on our website around what we believe are the 5 key questions now facing the sector to bounce forward. And I'll just leave you with 3 thoughts before we pivot to questions. COVID has created a paradigm shift in adult social care. There are significant challenges and opportunities that are presenting themselves now that we do need to grip going forward. Yet, we should have the confidence that the fundamentals of good adult social care remain unchanged. And thirdly, if you take an approach that is based upon understanding complexity within your local system, you can deliver a sustainable model of adult social care going forward based upon improving outcomes for people.